I knew that there was plague, I knew that there was a background of war to the emergence of Islam, and in the traditional accounts that I'd always read, this was slightly underplayed, and I thought, well, actually, having the ancient world's equivalent of the Black Death and the First World War rolled into a single horrific package, this must have had a far greater impact than the traditional Muslim sources would imply. So that was one aspect. I thought that the Near Eastern context and the sort of apocalyptic series of catastrophes that overwhelmed it must have had a greater impact than the traditional Muslim account implied. The second book was by Peter Heather, and it looked at the relationship between the Romans and the barbarians beyond the frontier. And Heather's point was that the relationship between the Romans and the barbarians on the Rhine and the Danube was an incredibly complicated one, spanning centuries. And of course, the Romans would periodically send out, rather like the Israelis do, into Gaza to smack up the opposition. But equally, they couldn't do that all the time. So they were just as likely to employ the barbarians as mercenaries, to give them subsidies, essentially bribe them to be quiet. And over the course of the centuries, Heather's argument was, this resulted in what had previously been disparate, fragmented, fractured tribal entities cohering, forming ever larger political units, and in short, becoming more Roman. To the extent that ultimately, by the 5th century, when the Roman Empire collapses into sort of periodic fratricidal strife that it was always going through, the tribal entities that rolled across the Rhine were of a wholly new order of seriousness, and ended up taking control of the provinces of the Western Empire. And again, I thought, well, this presents a sort of fascinating entree into the study of what happened with the Arab conquests. Might this explain what was going on there, or at least provide a context? So those were the two things I had lurking in the back of my mind. What I hadn't realised was that by rushing in where angels fear to tread, I was wading into an absolute academic minefield, because the issue of what happened in the 7th century in the Middle East, whether the Muslim sources are to be trusted, if they're not, what alternative narrative is to be constructed, if any, is probably the single most neuralgic area of academic research, not just in the study of ancient history, but probably any field of history that I've come across.